29 years ago today, my mother, CAROL STUART WATSON, died. She was only 54, and today I'm 54. Today I'm making a celebration, a tribute about my mother and about her life. My mother was born in 1931 in Georgetown, in the Georgetown Hospital. There were 7 kids in her family. She was the oldest. The youngest one, Uncle Jamie, my mom was 18 when he was born, so there was a lot of commotion at 4300 East West Highway, and she was always into painting and doing Christmas cards for people in the community, and obviously that was her love and her passion. So she graduated from BCC and then attended the University of Maryland, where she graduated in 1953 with a degree in fine arts. Very soon after that, she co-founded it was called the Georgetowner newspaper. It was a very local paper in Georgetown. She co-founded it with a woman named Amy Stewart, who also happened to have the same last name as my mom, but they spelled it differently. My mother was a phenomenal photographer, writer, and illustrator, which is really where she has left her legacy, is being a commercial illustrator. But this very first newspaper that she founded near our capital, she drew the masthead, and they used that black and white masthead for years. I think just 10 years ago they stopped using it again. But and from there, in 1959, my mom and dad got married, and in 1960 I was born, and they also founded or established Carriage Trade Publishing. And this company, true family-owned business with my mom and my dad, was created so that my mom could create a magazine called Shopping in Washington. So she would go out and get pictures of all the very beautiful shops in the DC and the Washington DC area and the Georgetown area. And she would interview them, she would take pictures, and she would write some beautiful copy about what a magnificent place this was to shop. And then my father would print these magazines, and they would sell them, I think, for 50 cents. This is back in the early 60s. So they were really the first big magazine like that to highlight all the shops in the Washington, D.C. area. And then they started to do a dining guide for D.C. and Georgetown. And they did that for forever. And she was such a great illustrator. They could put those together very quickly. So my mother, some of her other entrepreneurial things were taking a lot of these illustrations of the DC area and the Georgetown area and turning them into note cards or calendars, and then my father would print them up and they would sell them. So in 1976, the Montgomery County Historical Society commissioned my mother to do their Bicentennial Map. And I remember going to all those historic homes and my mom illustrating every single one of them and then putting them on this. It's a huge map. This map was then printed in limited quantities, and everywhere you would go in Montgomery County, you would see them at banks, you would see them at schools, you would see them at the major corporations. It was a tribute to the past 200 years of the Montgomery County area. So she printed it in 1976 for the Bicentennial. Mom also got into drawing Christmas cards, and she really, really loved that. Christmas was a very special time for her, as for a lot of us. And she had this magical way of just capturing a moment of excitement and putting it down on the Christmas card. I would say that my mom was a mix between Norman Rockwell and Tasha Tudor. Her art was not as realistic as Norman Rockwell, but it was soft and beautiful like Tasha Tudor. But she definitely had her own look. And very soon, I think it was Recycled Papers and Neiman Marcus, started seeing her work and started commissioning her to do some of these beautiful Christmas cards. And actually, right before she died in the early 80s, she won the Printing Industry of America Award for some wrapping paper called Bare Branches. And this was, she was so excited. It was a national award. She had been recognized as a corporate illustrator, graphic designer. And it just seemed like there was going to be so much more of that. She was at the pinnacle of her career when she died, and she was so prolific. There were just literally thousands of pieces of artwork in the Georgetown area and among family and friends. We have attempted to put them into albums on Facebook under CAROL STUART WATSON. Mom was also a muralist. Two of her most famous murals, one is with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in the D.C. area, and the other famous one is done at the Martin Marietta building, which is now Lockheed Martin, also in Bethesda, Maryland. She was commissioned by numerous plantation homeowners to go out and paint their dining room. My mom was also commissioned by the Washington Zoo to create a coffee mug that had the pandas on it. So she did this very simple design of a white cup and a black and white panda, and that coffee mug went around the world. They sold thousands and thousands and thousands of them. You can also see my mother's work on television. She was commissioned to cover the governor's trial of Martin Mandel way back when. So she was the court illustrator, and it was really fun to be at home and look up on television and see illustrations by CAROL STUART WATSON. I think my mother's favorite thing to do was children's books, illustrations in a lot of children's books. She did Where's Rachel, Hooray for Author, Flower Fables, Hey He Lock, Upstairs, Downstairs in a Victorian Dollhouse. All of them captured the charm of growing up, childhood memories. And those books were sold. You can still actually get those books on Amazon if you look for them. But she really loved illustrating children's books. Two stories I remember: when she was working on Hooray for Author, she had created this tiny little felt mouse. She sewed it together. And this was the main character in this book. And I remember we were invited to the White House, and she carried this little mouse, and she put it on the edge of the president's desk. And since we were not allowed to take pictures in the Oval Office, she sketched author on the corner of the president's desk. And that's now in that book, Hooray for Author. The other really fun thing was her book signing for that they held at Mount Vernon, of course, our first president's home. She had this wonderful book signing of Hooray for Author. On a personal note, she was the coolest mom. I remember sitting around our kitchen table, and there were always watercolors or acrylics and, cups full of brushes and, pencils and colored pencils. And we jokingly say, I think we had crayons and pencils in our hands before we actually learned to write. I mean, she had us drawing from a very, very young age. She even let us, each of us got to take a wall in the basement and do a mural on each of the walls. So she was a very creative mother to grow up with. And we would often sit around the kitchen table and just draw and paint and talk. I remember one night we had this very old refrigerator that was on its last leg, and she said, let's paint it. It's this like great big ugly black box. Let's paint it. So we put some primer on the main door, and we actually painted the refrigerator to look like her beautiful china. And once it was all done, we kind of hated to send it to the dump because it was so beautiful, but it was just another place to practice art, make a creation. I remember one night, well, she worked really hard. She had 3 of us. I'm the oldest, my middle brother John, and my youngest brother Dave. She had, my mom and dad had 3 kids, and they were entrepreneurs, and things were either really, really good or really, really not. And one night after work, it was July, it was really hot. I remember her taking this red sheet, and we went out and sat on the side yard, and she was so tired, and we both laid down, and I could still feel the grass. It was cool. It was a cool summer night. And I remember us looking up in the sky, and she was finding all the different constellations, and I think that was really the only time I ever saw my mother relax. But that was such a nice memory that I still have today. She, in 1983, I was a young Army wife, and we happened to be stationed in Italy, right on the Italian Riviera in a place called Tirrenia. And Mom managed to get away for 2 weeks, and we sat out on that front porch, and she painted and painted and painted. And those are a lot of the paintings that I actually sold when I started my first business at 24. So at 24, I started Collector's Corners. We were stationed in Augusta, Georgia, and when we were living in Italy, I bought a lot of paintings, and I painted a lot with Mom, so I had about 50 paintings that I could start a gallery with. So when I got back to Augusta, Georgia, moved back to the States, I decided to open my first business called Collector's Corners. And I was going to sell my mother's artwork. I was going to represent her. So in Italy, in Florence, they are known for having art shows along with fashion shows. So I took that same idea, and we did it in Augusta, Georgia, at a place called Susan's. And we displayed all this beautiful art around these beautiful pieces of clothing, and took everybody in, had a big reception, and sold all the artwork. So that was mid-December when we did that. And I know she wasn't feeling well then, and the doctors diagnosed her with a classic case of pneumonia. She couldn't stop coughing. So I remember Christmas morning talking to her, and she said, I'm still not feeling very well. So on New Year's Eve, I flew up and ended up taking her to the hospital, and really 19 days later, she died. Come to find out, she had extensive lung cancer. It was called adenocarcinoma, and it had spread everywhere. And after that, I remember coming back to Augusta, Georgia, and reaching out to everybody who bought my mother's paintings and saying, is there any way I can buy those paintings back? And they said, no, you don't want to do that. Share her beautiful talent with the world.